your family tree. That should probably be about 2/3 house.
Okay. Jeff, you're good.
I know I'm good, but how's the audio?
You're good. We're live. We're good.
All right. Sure.
Want to get through the introduction?
Yes.
Okay, so. Or you just listen to me. Okay, so I'm Nanette Mason-Jones. I am on the board of the Historical Society, and Chuck and I lead the program committee. So welcome to 2026. And so we'll do a little introduction. I think I was the last person in the entire village to not know Jeff. When I retired, did you not know Jeff? So now I know Jeff really well. But for those of us who want to remember, Jeff is a writer, storyteller, and minister in Licking County, our county. His Faith Works column runs each Friday in the Newark Advocate and in the Granville Sentinel. His notes from my knapsack appears every other week. He also contributes Wandering Licking County essays on a regular basis with Denison's Reporting Project, on whose advisory board that he sits. He is one of the founders of the Licking County Coalition for Housing. He has a long history with local nonprofits and community service work, along with his membership with Granville History and his longtime leadership with Scout. His spouse, Joyce Meredith, recently retired from Denison, and she keeps wanting to travel. Wanting to travel, but he still keeps finding, Jeff keeps finding new places in Licking County to visit. I did ask, I always like to ask people, what are like, if you had 3 things you wanted everybody to know about you, I said, what would those be? And Jeff said, often is truthful. 2, isn't as tall as I used to be. And 3, can get lost in archival research, which is typical for a man who won't ask directions. So welcome, Jeff Gill, and at the end I'll tell you about our next program.
Thank you very much. And it is a privilege to be opening for Granville and for the Granville Historical Society our venture into America 250 Ohio. Ohio is really taking a leadership role in the National America 250 effort around 250 years since the Declaration of Independence, so July 1776. Here we are 250 years later. And locally, we have a committee that's meeting. We're planning events on a monthly basis all the way through to the end of the year. So it's not just going to stop July 4th. In fact, in August, I think we're bringing back the mile-long picnic. So there's going to be a community meal up and down Broadway. So stay tuned, all kinds of stuff all through this year. Certainly a lot going on in July. In July, Granville, Kiwanis, make sure you can't get bored that first week, because what happens around July 4th in Granville? Street fair, parade, horses. You gotta have horses in the parade, right? If you don't know why, that I should have put that in the bio. Okay. So I was given the opportunity to kind of open us up as we're looking at all 250 years of history to try to go back to 1776. 1776 for Granville in particular, Licking County as a whole, is kind of tricky. There's a bit of a gap here, which I'm going to try to fill. But I'm also going to say many of you know, quite a few of you have heard me do talks at the Earthworks and about Native American narratives and archaeology and history here at Licking County. And often we have to ask people to understand the difference between prehistory and history. And it's a tricky balance to strike, because prehistory is simply before written records. So if you're in the Tigris Euphrates Valley, history goes back, 4,000 plus years. Here, history begins, right around 250 years ago. Our best regular written accounts, though, all start about 1800. Before that is been generally considered prehistory. I say it's tricky because my caution is both people think, well, we know nothing, which is not true. Lots of forms of evidence and means of inference we can come up with. And also, I guess the concern is especially the American story where we don't have written records, we can't account for it specifically. There's an assumption when I say prehistory, people think primitive, people think savage, people think ignorant. And that would be inaccurate, but that's a talk about the earthworks. But when I'm talking about Granville and Licking County in 1776, we do have some big gaps in the story, even when we're talking about Native Americans. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but you'll know a book I've probably recommended more times than any book this side of the Bible, but I hope Charles C. Mann appreciates that. 1491. What is he is a science journalist. He's not a scientist himself. He's careful to point that out. What he tries to do is give the average reader a sense of what not just North America, but the Western Hemisphere looked like right down to ground level before Columbus and subsequent waves of exploration arrived. He talks about a couple of things that are relevant to our story. Certainly one is something he refers to a few times as the Great Dying. The Great Dying. The wave of death that ripples across the Americas when European pathogens for which people in the Western Hemisphere had not developed immunity, it hit and it tore through populations. 70% is a low estimate for most areas. It ranges up above 90%, as best as we can tell, archaeologically and biochemically. Think about what that does to a population. 90% of your population dies, but the way these pathogens work, it tended to leave alive the very young and the very old. So it's not even that you get to survive with a nice sample across the board of your population. This is why we think we know what the pioneer accounts say about what North America was like, what Ohio was like, what Licking County was like. The problem is those first historical accounts come generations, decades, even hundreds of years after that death wave ripples up, say, from Hernando de Soto's expedition in the southeast, the wild pigs that they set loose, the pathogens from that ripples across the continent in the very early 1600s. Nobody's coming to look at the population of the native people, to ask them about their stories, to observe their life ways, until 50, 60, 75 years later, by which time that wave of death has gone through their population, and then they've rebuilt their society on the foundation of what went before. But as a lot of native people have said to me, we lost so much, and we rebuilt from there. So we do have a question that comes up with the earthworks fairly often, and that is, did any of the natives who were here when the first pioneers came, and we get into what's called history, did they know who built them? Well, remember, they've lost so much of their culture, so many of their practices, so much of their own history. Who knows what they remembered or who was where exactly? But then this also gets complicated by a second wave. A wave that has a certain amount of death that comes with it. This is the one I'm sure you learned about in school. This is over the door of the Canadian Parliament. The creature which built Canada. The beaver. There, that's a little more friendly. Beavers used to be all over North America. Beavers used to be in Europe, but they got hunted to extinction quite some time ago. Because it turns out, beaver skin, which makes sense when you think about where they live and how they live, gives you a kind of leather which is wonderfully weatherproof. wonderfully waterproof. And you can cure it and tan it and shape it into all manner of hats. You want a weatherproof hat, you wanted a beaver hat. Of course, this is the classic that we think of. Well, a lot of Native people went into the beaver hunting business. Remember, they've gone through the death wave, they've gone through their own cultural reconstruction, and then the first French trappers and traders, and behind them the Dutch and the British and others, they come and they say, bring us beaver pelts, we will give you a metal pot to cook in. If you had cooked in ceramics your whole life, and you got an opportunity to have a metal pot, I mean, I have literally sat and wondered, Bob, I'll bet you've done it. I mean, what kind of a cultural change does that bring to have a metal pot that you can put right on the fire? It would change everything, not just cuisine, but firewood gathering and just all kinds of effort and labor. And wait, you're telling me I bring you 20 of those stupid beaver skins, you give me a pot which will last forever? We started hunting here, hunting beaver. Except, well, and I don't want to get into the politics and the names and the specifics of it, but some Native American tribes said, I think we're going to take over this business and you're going to be pushed out. There was a lot of conflict through the 1600s between different Native American groups, and populations got pushed west and south. Some were driven to extinction. It was a tough time. But tribes that had guns, weapons with gunpowder and projectiles that you could fire a long distance, they cut quite a swath. If you had a gun and a good metal trap, you got the beaver. So what happens is, we get up to 1701, and the British come in and kind of try to settle all of this fighting out, and they clear out beaver hunting grounds. And which state is entirely within these beaver hunting grounds? Ohio. And to some degree, again, there's lots of scholarly disputes. You can get into specifics about tribes and names and groups. But most of the tribes who had been in this area got pushed west, got pushed south, some got pushed north. The British tried to manage this, but there were limits to that. And what happened shortly after this treaty, ironically enough, is that there's a breakdown in the system. There's also second and third ripples of these diseases. Smallpox starts to rumble through. And these later waves of smallpox kill off even the strongest tribes. And what happens is the iron control over the beaver trade starts to break down, and from 1701 forward, well, people start to come back. The Wyandot come down from the north of the Great Lakes, down into northern Ohio. The Shawnee come up from the south, where they've been pushed into Kentucky and even Tennessee. They start returning to what Shawnee said then, still say now, were their historic home, and certainly their hunting grounds. And the Delaware, sometimes called the Lenape, but they themselves say Delaware is okay, obviously from the name, at least from first contact. Where did the Delaware tribe live?
New Jersey.
Along the Delaware River. But they get pushed west, and further west, and further west. So in the state of Ohio, we have kind of an eastern pressure from the Delaware, a southern pressure from the Shawnee, a northern pressure from the Wyandot, and guess where we are? We're at the intersection, and we got seats right there. Slide on, just walk on around, you're fine. I'm just talking.
Give me.
Don't find from the speed bridge.
That's right. That's right. That would be cool. So I'm talking about prehistory and history. Often for our part of Ohio, kind of an arbitrary line is drawn with January 1751, Christopher Gist. He will become famous for being a tour guide for a young Virginia militia officer named what was that name? George Washington, yeah. But that's to come. But Christopher Gist himself, a trapper and a trader, is making a journey, and he leaves behind the journey. He leaves behind a written account of passing from what we call Fort Pitt, Pittsburgh now, across Ohio to the Scioto, into the south. And in Christopher Gist's journal, he talks about going to White Woman's Creek, on which is a small town. This white woman was taken away from England when she was not above 10 years old by the French Indians. She is now upwards of 50 and has an Indian husband and several children. Her name is Mary Harris. If you've been to Roscoe Village, you've been anywhere on that side of Coshocton, you've heard about the white woman, Mary Harris, who marries into native culture. And in large chunks of native culture, especially those who were most active here in Ohio, it tended to be much more matriarchal. I was just hearing about a meeting of the League of Women Voters last night, God bless them. Well, I think women were the only ones who got to vote back in those cultures. Boy, there's a presentation we have to talk about sometime. Mary Harris was the leader of her community. Women had those sorts of roles. Christopher Gist found this strange because he was much more of an English male. And you may know men like that who are a little surprised to find women in roles of authority. No, that's Gist in 1751. Gist will leave shortly after this account for the Scioto. At one point, he talks about skirting the Great Buffalo Song. It is, as best as we can tell, the first written account of somebody in the winter of 1751 crossing the terrain of Licking County. We think. We're not sure. It's the most logical path he would have taken, probably cutting through the area we call Perryton now, coming down to the area of Barn, Montour's Point, cross the river a little closer to Newark. The giant basket, by the way, was not there in 1751. But the area around the basket, the Bowling Green, still called Bowling Green, Bowling Green Cemetery, there's a township, which is in the county, which constantly confuses people. But anyhow, an open, flat place. The first English colonists called anything that was open and flat a bowling green, kind of like we call it a tennis court. The Bowling Green, alongside of the Licking River, is probably where Gist paused, but he didn't camp. He kept going, heading for the Hockhocking, Lancaster area. And then we've got another gap. And you're all sitting here. Yeah, it's 7:21 already, and you're going, but I want to hear about Granville in 1776. Well, we're kind of creeping up on it, but I'm going to be honest with you. I'm jumping back and forth on either side of the year because we have a hole. We have a gap. But we can infer quite a bit from what is known, both historically and also occasionally in the records. And a lot of it is because of this fellow. I have come to enjoy getting to know Reverend David Jones. This volume is the Life, Journal, and Works of David Jones. He was a Welsh Baptist preacher. His parents were from Wales, but he grew up in Freehold, New Jersey. He becomes a Baptist preacher. And in 1772, he's well, I don't want to say he's hot-headed, but he does have a bit of a temper, as you'll hear shortly, quite emphatically. And he doesn't like to be contradicted. Have you ever met a preacher like that? But, you know, preachers can be kind of protective of the pulpit. If you're going to ask me to preach the word to you week in, week out, I don't want you all trying to edit me as I go. You kept saying, well, don't talk about this. Or, now you're going to talk about that, right? David Jones talked about what he was going to talk about. He did it his whole life until his death in 1820. He got himself into hot water, into hot situations time and time again. But in 1772, he preaches a sermon which gets published in pamphlet form entitled Defensive War in a Just Cause, Sinless. He was preaching about the movement towards independence. In northern New Jersey, there were already a lot of people in 1772 saying, we've had enough of these British. We've had enough of Parliament. We've had enough of the king. Are you starting to feel like we're doing the 250 thing now?
Oh, yeah.
Right? Okay. And, we've had enough of the royal governor of New Jersey, William Franklin. Yes, the son of, who will stay loyal to the British crown to the end of his life, even though his father is Benjamin Franklin, something that weighed heavily on old Ben all his life. But David Jones in Freehold, New Jersey in 1772 says, and I'm just reading one paragraph, "We have no choice left to us but to submit to absolute slavery and despotism, or as free men to stand in our own defense and endeavor a noble resistance. Matters are at last brought to this deplorable extremity. Every reasonable method of reconciliation has been tried in vain. Our addresses to our king have been treated with neglect or contempt." He had opinions, but so did the Loyalists. Remember William Franklin? Ken Burns has done a program, which I suspect many of you watched, and reminded us of something we got to keep in mind. There were a certain number of people who were starting to speak up in the 1770s for freedom, for liberty, even for independence. There was almost an equal number of people on the other end saying, but we've sworn an oath to King George III. We are loyal British subjects living in the American colonies. But what is this madness of which you speak? And if you watch Ken Burns' program, I hope you took note of the fact that tarring and feathering is not a joke. There ain't nothing funny about it. It sounds comic 250 years later. And it's what the Loyalists sometimes did to those who spoke up for liberty. The pamphlet has an interesting liberty cap on a liberty pole symbol on the facing page of this pamphlet, which David Jones so proudly published. Well, David Jones wouldn't shut up. Good for him. But he had parishioners, he had friends of the Baptist church who said, we're hearing some rumors here in New Jersey about how the Loyalists feel about this. They're not happy. They're starting to heat up the tar. They're starting to rip open pillows. And they said to David Jones, you know what? We need to get you out of here. You need to take a trip. A long trip. They'll calm down. You'll calm down a little bit. And then, you know what? Come back 1773. I'm sure it'll all blow over. Well, it made sense in 1772. But there was also another interesting point, which has to do with the fact that he had a brother, John Jones. I'm looking for people to flinch. In Licking County, you say John Jones, and some of us start to have convulsions. Don't do genealogy and get casual about your John Joneses. David's brother, John, an older brother, was at Braddock's defeat. He had been in the West, and the West wasn't even close to where we are. But he had been West, he had been at Braddock's defeat, he'd been among Native people. In fact, David is studying for a medical degree, even as he's preaching. It's possible in 1772, ministry didn't pay terribly well. And he was fascinated by what his brother taught him about Indian herbal cures, about native medicine. And ministers were expected not only to care for the souls of their parishioners, but also for their bodies. They were often the only educated person in the community. And so they were expected to know something about which plant was good for what ails you. So David had learned from his brother, he heard stories, and also there was talk in the Welsh community. Have you ever heard of such a thing as a Welsh community? Here we are, Granville Historical Society. Does the subject come up from time to time?
Just,
It does. And also about Prince Madoc of Wales in 1170. And a much beloved story, which I have to tell you as somebody who does tours and programs at the York Earthworks, a story that will not die. The Prince Madoc led a band of his warriors in boats to the west, and they sailed to where the sun set and even beyond, and they came to North America, and they built up a great Welsh kingdom, which was always about 3 days farther than anybody had been. The story wouldn't die, and it developed an interesting twist, because some people, I don't know if John was one of them, but some people come back to Welsh settlements in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and they say, I was among some of the native people along the Ohio and the Scioto and the Tuscarawas, and I spoke in Welsh, and they understood me. And I heard them speak in their language, and I distinctly heard traces of the old tongue from Wales and what they had to say. This is an incredibly popular story, which I want you to know has not a single scrap of confirmation linguistically anywhere of any sort. Shawnee is not descended from Welsh. Got it? If anybody asks you, that's what I told you. But in 1772, there was still some thought that, what if we get David Jones out from under this tension with the Loyalists in northern New Jersey, and we also send him to preach the gospel to the savages, as they would put it back then. And perhaps, if he speaks to them in the Welsh, which he knows well from his parents, we might have a break. They might know that tongue just as well. So for mixed motives, and let's be honest, what human endeavor doesn't have mixed motives behind it, David Jones travels west and he spends 2 years. He preaches all along the Ohio and the Scioto and back across overland to Fort Pitt. He preaches to many different people, mostly Shawnee, few Wyandot, occasionally Delaware. He baptizes precisely 0 native people. He finds precisely 0 Welsh-speaking Indians. But he writes a book. He's already an author. Why wouldn't he write this? And I take some pleasure in the fact that early in my researches, long before I could get a hold of a book like this, I was able to find out that the book, A Journal of 2 Visits, made to some nations of Indians on the west side of the River Ohio in the years 1772 and 1773. Yes, that's the title. Not the first chapter. That's the title. That book was in Thomas Jefferson's library at Monticello.
Wow.
It was among the books after 1812 that he donates as the foundation of the Library of Congress. He read it. He was curious. Part of his research that gives us the Lewis and Clark expedition, among other things. It's a very widely read book. It was a travelogue of going west, exploring this hitherto unknown frontier, and coming back to New Jersey and telling his story. And as you no doubt figured out, on February 10th, 1773, he passes through Licking County and he stays the night. He becomes, I would say, the first true historical record in terms of a written account of somebody who is unambiguously in Licking County. And he likes it. Don't forget that point. In his account, on February 10th, he says, before night came to the designed town called Dan Elliott's Wife's. I could do a whole program on those 3 words. It's a little complicated.
No, not you.
First,
Sam.
we have a Samuel Elliott that I kind of suspect that's who this is, but I'm not sure. And the typeface says DAN. On the other hand, it's transcribed from notes long after the fact. Was it Sam Elliott and it becomes Dan? Don't know. We cannot trace any traitor, any white person who had anything to do with the West who's called Daniel Elliott. Even the last name, we're pretty sure, is spelled incorrectly, but I give it to you exactly as Thomas Jefferson would have read it. The town is called Daniel Elliott's Wives. Remember? Matriarchy. Who's in charge? Who's in charge, ladies?
Women.
The women. That's how Shawnee, and in large part, that culture was structured. Now, here's where we get the cultural context of the person writing the story. They came to this designer, it probably refers designated, we would say, town, called Daniel Elliott's Wives. A man of that name was said to have here a squaw for his pretended wife. A lot going on in that sentence. I'll just boil it down this way. David Jones is a Christian pastor. This was not a Christian marriage. If they had not been married by a minister in church with a license from the state, is it a legitimate marriage? Not from his point of view. So that's what he means by pretended. It may sound a little harsher today than it was meant, but it clearly has some cultural context, which we just have to acknowledge. This is a small town consisting of Delawares and Shawnees. Already here we see the mix there. Remember, Delawares pushed from the east, Shawnee coming up to the north, back from their hunting grounds to where their homeland had been. The chief is a Shawnee woman who is esteemed very rich. She entertains travelers. This is a traveling kind of community. If she has the ability to entertain travelers, she's wealthy by their standards. Just like in the early historical accounts, if you had glass in your windows, it was a mansion. Might still be framed in 2 rooms, but if you had glass, it was a mansion. She's esteemed very rich. She entertains travelers. There were 4 of us in company. David Jones, a trader we'll meet here in a moment, and their 2 interpreters. And for our use, her Negro quarter was evacuated this night, which had a fire in the middle, the chimney. We'll come back to the asterisk. The Negro quarter. And full turn, we're familiar with it. It hints at something that we want to think about. But there's a structure with a smoke hole and a fireplace in the center. You have a chimney, it wasn't a cabin, but it sounds like it was big enough and solid enough to be confused for a cabin. So Jones makes it clear, it didn't have a chimney, it had a fire in the middle. But still a solid structure for the night. This woman has a large stock and supplied us with milk. She has cows? Ooh, she is wealthy. Unless she had goats. But that's a different conversation. Here also we got corn for our horses at a very expensive price. Have you ever heard of a traveler who didn't like complaining about the cost of accommodations? There's Jones. But Mr. Duncan, David Duncan, the trader who was basically David Jones's guide for the whole second 2/3 of his trip, Mr. Duncan paid for me here and in our journey till we parted up towards Steubenville, just before he makes the final trip back before heaven. About a mile before we came to this town, we crossed a clear, large stream called Salt Lick Creek, which empties into the Muskingum, on which the chief Delaware town is situated. That chief Delaware town, Coshocton, right? We've already heard about it from Christopher Gist back in 1751, further up. But where did he cross and where is this village, Daniel Elliott's wife's town? We don't know for sure. If you look closely at maps here, you may or may not realize that through Sharon Valley, a creek flows and it runs right through the Ohio State Newark campus. And a lot of people assume, well, that must be Sharon Creek, right? Because it runs through Sharon Valley. But it's not. It's Elliott's Creek. Except we think we know which Elliott that's named after, and he comes later. Unless he's related to this Elliott, we can't put it together. It's hard to say. It is much more likely, though, that Daniel Elliott's wife's community is that spot which today we call Montour's Point, just above the Bowling Green, just east of the Giant Basket, just west of the town of Warren. That's probably where they were. There's a Shawnee Run that runs just west of that area. A lot of other accounts keep referring to a community there, but we don't know for sure. It's a supposition. They travel on, again, what we call Licking Valley Road, heading up towards Perryton, and then on across country to Coshocton, and then back to Fort Pitt. The country here, David Jones says, and if you walk out of here with nothing else, I want you to hold this in your head and maybe in your heart. David Jones, in the first written account of Licking County that we have in our historical record, says, the country here appeared calculated for health, fertile, and beautiful. That's our home. David Jones comes through here, one Native American settlement. He stays one night, but as he's riding across it, he looks around and he says, I perceive that this landscape is calculated for health. I mean, you often think that in the morning, don't you? Sounds like this place made a mark with David Jones. It did. We'll come back. That asterisk. This woman is Daniel Elliott's wife. So Daniel Elliott is the European, an Englishman probably, who's married a Shawnee woman who is the leader of the clan and the head of the village. This woman has several Negroes who were taken from Virginia in time of last war. In time of last war. That would be the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. We're talking 10 years earlier. A decade earlier, Africans who were living in Virginia had come here. And now esteemed as her property. I want you to know, I talked to 2 Shawnee chiefs and 1 Shawnee Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, and we have bounced these passages back and forth. Esteemed. Remember, reference up at the top, she is esteemed very rich. She is considered very rich. There's a bit of a hint, can you hear it? That from Jones's point of view, he's going, well, for a native, she's rich. Does that mean she's actually rich, or just that people think of her as rich? In the same way, the semantics of and now esteemed as her property. We're left with a puzzle and a historical challenge. Because all of the Shawnee today who know their own tribal history, their culture very well, better than I, each of them has said to me, Jeff, I got to admit, some of our ancestors held people in slavery. But not often. And there's an opening for this here. Are they considered slaves because being free blacks out of Virginia, having escaped during the war and come west and now living in a structure that seems to be their own, again called a Negro quarter? And what would that have meant culturally to David Jones, and how would he have applied that to living arrangements in Daniel Elliott's town? We don't know. We don't know for sure. Were they enslaved people? Or were they free people who risked enslavement if they went back to Virginia? And so they were under her care. We do not know for sure. But we do know this. We have a woman in leadership in Licking County before we've heard of anybody else in leadership in this place. We have Wyandotte and Shawnee people living here. And before any European white-faced people come to live here, they're Africans, African Americans, Negroes, in James's phrase. Black people lived in Licking County before white people did. I share that, and I've shared this in a different program I did some months back, wanting to make it very clear. Friends, I had to confront something when this passage suddenly hit me. I've been looking at this passage out of David Jones's travel journal for 30 years before it hit me. Wait a minute, Jeff. This means black people lived here before any white people built cabins and stayed through a winter. The basic definition of what it means to be a settler. They had a solid quarters, albeit with no chimney, and they lived here and had apparently been living here for some time in that village. Black people are not just part of the history of Licking County, they're part of our earliest history. I share that as a confession of some of my blind spots, which I'm still coming to learn about. Now, some of you are noticing, okay, Jeff, it's still 1773. Because there's basically, historically speaking, a gap. David Jones heads out February 11 and goes on to Coshocton and on back to Fort Pitt a few days after that. And we don't really have much of a good historical reference tied directly to this area until about 1799. But if you'll allow me, our local history is very active in the person of David Jones, who has a whole lot to do with 1776 and events following after. Some of you know this picture. Some of you may have seen the large painting that's at the rotunda of our United States Capitol, painted by John Trumbull. It's sometimes confused as the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It's not that. It's the presentation of the draft by the Committee of Five. And Jefferson and Adams and Franklin and Sherman and Livingston are coming up to the chair, and they're presenting their draft, which will be revised and ultimately voted on and approved and give us a reason to have a party in 250 years, right? Is there a Licking County connection in this picture? Well, there kind of is. But let me also point out, Trumbull himself admitted the whole painting is a giant anachronism. Not all the people he painted, and he worked hard to meet people or find images to paint all the participants in, including people who weren't there in July of 1776. They may not have been there, but he got their faces right. And in fact, if you look behind John Adams's head, if you look behind the committee on the far wall of that chamber, how many of you have been to that chamber in Philadelphia, that the Declaration of Independence and Constitution? Isn't that a cool room? Mm-hmm. They do not still have a panoply on that wall. A panoply. What is a panoply? You may have heard the word used in a variety of contexts, but technically speaking, a panoply is an assembly of captured banners and weapons to signify a victory. It goes back to ancient Rome, in the Senate House in Rome. But not when the Declaration of Independence was presented, but a few weeks afterwards, messengers came bearing banners and halberds, drums and bugles captured from the British at Fort Ticonderoga. And they were affixed in a panoply to the wall. And it hung there through most of the Revolution until its end. Well, that panoply, in large part, was brought by, yes indeed, David Jones. David Jones leaves here, goes back to New Jersey, keeps mouthing off about freedom and liberty. Finally, the loyalists say, okay, now we're going to cook him. Now we're going to tar and feather him. And he gets a job in a quiet, secure, safe place a little further west, across the Delaware River, near a place called, it's next to a valley, a Baptist church. Valley, it's got a blacksmith shop in it, Valley
Forge.
Oh, right, Valley Forge. Yeah, the war will never come this far west. He becomes the pastor of Valley Forge, and he ends up becoming one of the first chaplains in the Continental Army. Did I mention he has a temper? Did I mention he was kind of a volatile character? I can only give you a small snippet of it here, but Anthony Wayne, who he stays friends with to his very end of his life, he in fact preaches Anthony Wayne's funeral. Anthony Wayne, July 31st, 1776, sends a letter from Ticonderoga to Benjamin Franklin, the Continental Congress, and he says, "Dear sir, we are so far removed from the seat of government of the free and independent states of America, and such an insurmountable barrier, Albany, between us, that scarcely one letter or the least intelligence can reach here from your quarter. Through the medium of my chaplain, I hope this will find you, as he has promised to blow out the brains of the man who will attempt to take it from him."
That's pretty good.
My brother. That's a minister for you. Anthony Wayne, who also becomes known later as who? Mad Anthony Wayne. Yeah, but he thinks David Jones is crazy. Has promised to blow out the brains of the man who will attempt to take it from him. He brings the message, and he brings the captured arms of the British to Philadelphia. And as you know from that painting, he got them there. Part of our story for 1776. David Jones is kind of a Forrest Gump in early America. He's at Yorktown. He's right there. Okay, he's not in the picture, but he's there. Just out of picture by the rows of officers. He's the only chaplain on the scene, and he witnesses the surrender at Yorktown. In 1785, he ends up rejoining his old friend Anthony Wayne, who comes out after St. Clair's defeat and ends up in an Indian war. We know from some of the records that we have here that between 1773 and 1799, David Jones made at least 4 trips into the Ohio country. He was visiting friends. He was exploring. He wasn't just being a chaplain. And he was looking at real estate. Remember that land calculated for health, fertile, and beautiful? He kept coming back. Has anybody here walked from Philadelphia to Licking County at any point? He did it 4 times, and then he really gets going. But in 1795, he is with Anthony Wayne at the Treaty of Greenville on the western border of Ohio and Indiana. And the rotunda of the Ohio State House, I'm not sure which one was with you. That's a little bigger. The Ohio State House has the Howard Chandler Christie painting, the Treaty of Greenville, which was central to the establishment of Ohio as we know it in many ways. And that treaty, the last page of it is fascinating because many of the signatures, of course, remember that fuzzy line between prehistory and history. Most of the native leaders from all the different tribes who participated put their mark. Some made an X, some have fascinating pictograms. Pictograms which are still discussed to this day with the tribes, the people. You can see some of these symbols for the Chippewa, the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, some of the symbols even in the back you can probably make out. And it's big enough you might be able to make out that in the upper left corner, there's a signature. If you can't see it in the back, how's that? David Jones. This is one of the books down in the county administration building with the county recorder. I could spend easily 2 more hours just talking about the history of David Jones from 1799 to the end of his life in 1820. Suffice it to say, he made another dozen trips to this part of the country from the Valley Forge area, to the point where not long before her death, his wife said, "David, would you quit going to Ohio?" And David said, "You knew who I was when you knew." So she died. And he kept coming. War of 1812 starts. He signs up to be a chaplain again. He's at the Battle of Lundy's Lane. He finally goes back to Valley Forge, retires as a preacher. He writes his will in 1818 and dies at the age of 83 in 1820. That will is executed, of course, in Newtown, Pennsylvania, and also in Newark, Ohio, because his single largest landholdings were here. The area of Clay Lake, he owned about 200 acres over there, and I've had trouble pinning it down precisely, but south of River Road in the southern part of Granville Township, he owned at least another 40 to 60 acres over on this side of the county as well. Hundreds of acres, all lined out here where they had to transcribe his will in Licking County because so much of it was probated in this place. I'm not going to read all that to you. He owned a lot of property over time. His signature. And his... David Jones was quite a character. I'm not going to say he was a good man in every possible way. I don't think his wife was always too happy with him, but David Jones was a charismatic figure who stayed friends with not just Anthony Wayne, but many of the soldiers for whom he served as chaplain. People like Jonathan Benjamin, who had many daughters and sons-in-law who came to Granville Township. In fact, there's good reason to believe that the original Welsh settlement came here directly at the encouragement and the personal direction of Chaplain Jones himself, which stands to reason, good Welshman that he was. He knew where this man was, he met with him in Gill, Pennsylvania, and he led them here. Much of our early history as a county traces directly back to that fellow who passed through in 1773 and said, calculated for help, fertile and field. He never lived here, he preached here, he owned property here, and he brought some of our ancestors here as well. And I also don't want to lose sight of the twist I learned as I'm trying to pin down what can I say about Licking County in 1776. There's this stone, a couple counties away, but the site of White Woman's Village, home of Chief Eaglefeather, whose wife, Mary Harris, was the first white woman in Ohio, and also a leader in Ohio. She led her community, just as did Daniel Elliott's wife, a woman whose name we do not know. But even David Jones had to concede for leadership. And the occupants of those Negro quarters, we don't know how many, we don't know how soon they came, we don't know how long they were here, but their presence is a part of our history. Friends, in 1776, there's very little I can tell you for sure, but our history is not always exactly what we think it is. I hope this has given you some different angles to reflect on that. For the Shawnee, the Wyandot, the Africans, the women, the men, and also the memories of David Jones, who, as he was taking a message from Ticonderoga to Philadelphia, was thinking, I gotta get back to Cape Town. Thank you. ask questions.
No, I was like, we could take questions if everybody.
You can have a question. That's
Well,
all right.
questions, you have questions?
I can make up answers. What was that first point of the three?
Mostly truthful.
Often truthful.
Often truthful.
Yes.
So, great story and it's done very proudly.
He's all about, yeah.
That's my question. Because you, as you've been travelers, and there must have been many travelers, and who knows, maybe other white women, you know what I mean?
So David Duncan, oh, if he had left us a journal like Christopher Gist did, wouldn't that be wonderful?
So,
Yeah.
with modern technology and everything, now we can search every document going through every historian and historical journalist. Would you say there's been an exhaustive search for information, written information that doesn't happen?
There's always hope. There's always hope. I'm not too encouraged just because you're right, there's gotta be more. It's not an infinite set. It's a discrete number of people, but it could be, and most of them just didn't keep written records. We're not sure Duncan was literate, which would really impede his ability to read behind the diary. So we just don't know. So I'm not going to give up. There is stuff I found online that I know didn't exist 30 years ago. But also, and that's why I hope you heard that part of the story clearly, I've been looking at that exact passage for 30 years before it hit me. There were black people in Licking County before there were white people. That's my belief. The evidence was there, the story was there, I haven't put it together properly yet. So I think sometimes there's not only new discoveries, but there's going back to things that we think we know and say, oh wait, what does it actually say? And sometimes, us archival fans say, oh, it was there all the time. I just kept looking past it. Speaking of archivists.
In that specific context.
Yes.
Context, I feel like you're reading Daniele out of the picture when you say all these black people were here in his village before he was.
Well, we know he had a pretended wife. He had, and you probably know this, Samuel Elliott. I'm thinking of their stories, and sometimes they're punted back to Pontiac's rebellion, but that doesn't quite fit. And there are Elliots in Pennsylvania that keep showing up here, and most of them end up in the Nevada area. I'd love to tie them together. If it's the Elliot, I think it is, he came and went and came and went and came and went. He never seemed to stay put much until after about 1804, 1803. So I don't know. You were correct. It's possible there's a Daniel Elliott spelled differently, who's a different guy whose name was actually Daniel, who came here in 1763. Married into the Shawnee tribe, had children, and then disappeared. But there's no other breadcrumbs. And if there had been a white guy who had been here consistently for a stretch earlier, you'd think there'd be more hints and references to it, like all the Montour accounts and that kind of thing. So I have a feeling there's more hidden for him, but I can't prove that either. But a very good point. You're catching me at all the little shortcuts I'm taking to try to make this a 1-hour presentation. And I love it. I'm here for it. Yes.
The land holdings
Yes.
that Jones had here in Licking County.
Yeah.
Did he, was that payment for being a veteran of the Revolution?
It's three different means. He got some as a veteran. He got some that were given to him. I think that we're trying for bringing people here and showing them where to go. And some of it he bought as an investment, just came and purchased it. So, and I can't pin down the specific, mercantile origin of each tract. Somebody might be able to do that. That's where you get into the stuff that really gets your eyes crossed up in the recorder's office. And I'll tell you, reading that handwriting.
Yeah.
Before we were a county, we were part of Fairfield County, and the early deeds for this whole area are there.
Yeah, I mean, his records seem to start showing up at the right time. I don't say I've looked at everything, but he gets given property. That's clear. He got some as a veteran, but then traded it back east, because that's 90% of all the soldiers of the Revolution who got land grants just did a swap or took like 10 cents on the dollar for it. And then they weren't the ones who first came here. 90%, I think, is a conservative estimate. So, yeah, it's very murky how all that goes. Yeah, David Jones was interested in this area in a very deep and intense way. And the fact that he has this patchwork of properties just tells you, along with the fact that he took all those trips. And if you go back in the old books, old accounts, you'll keep dropping into, and old Chaplain Jones came by and preached. Wait, what? 1808, he'll just drop into a story and then disappear. And if you don't know who Chaplain Jones is, when you start putting those dots together. Yes.
I assume that the indigenous population was pretty well removed by this time.
By which time?
1776.
Well, so
And it's not.
the short version is usually the Iroquois pushed them out. Beaver Wars, and then as they dealt with smallpox and the French and the British having a disagreement, they retrenched. The Shawnee are coming back, the Land Otter coming back, or getting pushed west. So there are these patchwork of villages, including another Wyandotte village we know was up off of, I think, Hankinson Road, when the first European pioneers are coming through here. So that's the problem. They've been pushed off, but they're coming back in 1772 and kind of reestablishing themselves. And we don't know how long they've been here. Have they been here since the end of the 7 Years' War?
We have no idea the numbers.
Just a couple of villages. One up by Johnstown, one north of the village, and this one that I think is close to one. So call it 3 villages. Yes, hold on. You and then you. Yes.
That was one of my questions was, when was the last year that you joined that and Charlie tribes were still here?
So for those of us who love the Granville stories, they talk about Native people at least passing through, if not actually living around, right up to Indian removal, right up to 1830. So there are lots of references, even in the 1820s, that people were familiar with Native coming back and acknowledging this was their land. But tough luck for you. So there were Native people who came through, but not really an occupation.
My other question was, is Jones Road?
Yes.
When you have to-
I also have to defer to the better Welsh historians than myself, but I'm almost 100%
I
confident
don't know.
that it's not, but I don't know. I would love to find that. It could be a coincidence that John Sutton is living off of Jones Road, but I just do not know the answer.
There were a lot of, there's conversations, there were a lot of things.
We're swimming in Joneses, so yeah. And I can't tell you exactly when that started getting called Jones Road, but I don't see the name Jones Road on maps until after John Sutton Jones's time. So I'm just not certain that was under Jones.
All right,
Sir.
one more.
I'm trying to place David Jones in time compared to Johnny Appleseed, who of course owned acres of acres and was bringing out the apples so that people had to have apple trees to make Applejack in order to keep their property. Do you remember when Johnny Appleseed
Yeah.
was around here and out around Mount
There's a
Vernon?
lovely two-person show I could write of an elderly Jones making his last trip back here as John Chapman, Oregon evangelist, is sitting down by the fire with him. Johnny Appleseed came through here 1810-ish through 1830-ish. So they might have overlapped at the very tail end of Jones's life. But nice try, though.
All right,
Thanks,
okay. If you come up with a question, sometimes people like to ask a question in person rather than with the group, so Jeff will linger. I wanted to tell you when we next gather. So this really was, Jeff is right, this was our kind of kickoff of our 250th. It's going to be a lot of programs around it. It's the 250th birthday, but two of those programs will be connected to Granville 250. Is that what we're going 250 Granville 250? Granville 250.
250.
Granville 250. And there are two of those programs. One will be in February, so that's our next gathering. On February 21st, which is not a Wednesday evening, it's not a Thursday evening, it's a Saturday afternoon, which is very unusual for us. But as part of the Granville 250, we are going to be open on the afternoon of February 21st for an open house here, even though that's usually not open in the winter, but we're going to be open that Saturday afternoon from 2 to 5 for an open house. And the theme of that open house, which we're working with the Rotary on, is the evolution of downtown Granville. It's about the evolution of business in Granville and how it affected us. And as we run up to the open house, which will open at 2, Chuck, our own Chuck Peterson, will give a talk at 1:30 in this room. So it's a Saturday afternoon, 1:30. It's already on the Historical Society website, so you'll be there. And we'll also have a Granville 250 program in April, which will be on transportation. And but it will be an evening program. But all the February, March, and April programs are all on the website already, so you can check those out. And again, please, another great hand for. We just changed leadership. We have a new president. The term of Eric's term is over, and Cynthia has agreed for the third time. Vice president. Chuck's been president. I've been everything. So between the two of them, we have great seasoned leadership going into this year. So thank you all for coming in again. Jeff will linger and talk to you.
I now know what I'm